is interpreting soil test reports, which is timely as we get into fertilizing season. For those of you that maybe haven't seen this before, my name is Jay. I work as an extension and technical specialist at Perennia, exclusively serving the Christmas tree industry. And I've asked Amy Sangster to join me on this presentation today as well. Amy also works at Perennia and she works exclusively with soils. This presentation acts as a bit of a frequently asked question forum. So we're going to cover the basics on soil from growing Christmas trees. And of course, I'm focusing most of the data here on balsam fir when it's available. And we've got a crash course on using the soil survey maps. We'll discuss why it's necessary to soil sample, as well as how to do it, and what you should be looking for when you get your results back from the lab. And then we'll go a step a little bit further and talk about planning your lots based on those soil test reports. All right, we talked about what to look for in a lot establishment in our last session, so that information is still available on the YouTube channel if you want to go back to it. But this presentation is going to focus exclusively on just your soils. So the fundamentals of an acceptable soil in terms of Christmas tree production are listed off on this slide. The first thing, which is arguably most important, is that balsam fir needs good drainage. Trees will not do well in areas that are temporarily saturated throughout the year or consistently wet either. There will be issues in getting seedlings going, warding off root rots and fungal disease, and growth will be stumped among other things. The second one there, the pH and fertility, are another main factor that you'll hear me talk about. And I talk about pH a lot because they go hand in hand with pH and fertility. So soils with good pH, and I'm talking in the range of 5.5 to 6 for Christmas trees, which might sound a little high to you, but they can better accommodate nutrient facilitation to the tree. In Nova Scotia, soils are typically acidic, and you'll see that especially true in Christmas tree lots, and often that translates into wasted nutrients, because the acidity of your soil limits the use of the application of whatever you're applying. Fertile soils will have good organic matter, which supplies a variety of services to the soil, the habitat, and the tree, and it will have nutrients in a form that's available to plants to use. And the most important one for Christmas trees are going to be your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, and your magnesium. Moisture is another important factor here, especially for new seedlings. Your roots need to be able to access water with soil pores to facilitate nutrient transport and their growth. So your soils are going to need to be able to hold on to moisture. And finally, depth. So trees will grow in rocks, I've seen it, but they're going to do a lot better if there's enough depth of soil for lateral root penetration. That doesn't need to be a depth of 30 centimeters like you'd be looking for in some other crops, but the better depth of loose fertile soil you have, the better your trees are going to do. I think most of you would be familiar with the soil surveys. I've been using them a lot lately to do remote site assessment, and they're an invaluable tool for gauging your lots. I had an instant last fall where I went out to a lot, and within a couple feet of the same site, there were trees that were performing really well, right next to trees that were struggling with disease issues. When we took a look at the lot on the soil survey map, we saw huge variation in drainage, even within the same block of trees. So those two areas needed to be managed separately. I'm going to play this little video that Amy put together for the nutrient management planning course, but it's a great depiction of how to go about using these surveys for your own lots. So just bear with me while I switch to that page.
Side road fields here. You can tell from the satellite view that they're actually set up in a rotational grazing system here, and there's some research plots in the back. Once you've identified your fields in Google Maps, then you can pull up the Canadian Soil Information Services website. And this website houses the soil survey maps and the reports as well, each of the provinces in Canada. When you click on Nova Scotia, you'll see that there are a number of reports available to you. Some of the reports are a little bit older, but they still contain a lot of valuable information, and they're a great place to start to try and get a handle on the type of soil that your fields are on. So you've got two options here. You can view the report or you can download the data. The data is actually a shape file, and unless you have software that can handle shape files, you most likely won't be using it. So unless you have something like ArcGIS, you'll likely be using the PDF version of these reports. And they have the report available here and the maps as well. So you can download the maps, which I've done, and the map that I was looking for was the map south. So once you download that map, then you can scroll through the map and find some common landforms and see if you can identify where your fields are. And if we take a look here, here's Brookside and here's Bible Hill, and so our fields are actually located in here. So the corresponding map unit symbol is WD3/C. And for each of the provinces on the map, there is a corresponding legend. So if you have a symbol, you scroll down to find legend, and our soils are Woodville soil. They'll give you some information in terms of what the soil is and on its parent material. So this is a sandy loam soil. It'll also give you an indication of drainage, and the WD3 soils are imperfectly drained. So that's interesting because it is a sandy loam, so there's something happening there. It'll also give you an indication of the stoniness. So this is non to slightly stony and non-rocky. There's also an explanation of the map unit symbol, and so it includes some information about the slope class as well. So once you've picked up some information from the map, you can go and then you can check out the actual report. And when you pull up the report, it gives you even more detailed information. So it contains some information about the parent material and landform, the location extent, and then the soil characteristics. And if you read through the soil characteristics, it's telling you that it's a sandy loam, but it's over a firm subsoil. And in this firm subsoil, there may be weak to moderate fragipan development. And this fragipan and this firm subsoil may impede drainage. And so that's good to know. When you scroll down and find the WD3 soils, it gives you a little more information in this report on these soils, and it tells you that they're composed of imperfectly drained, glade humoferric podzol and fragic humoferric podzol. These terms come from the Canadian system of soil classification, and that's also available online. So if you want more information on how to define them, you can refer to that information online. But for the most part, what you'll need is contained in this report. So we already know there could be a drainage issue here. Again, these WD3 soils, they have subsoils that are compact, slowly permeable, and usually fragic. So this is good to know because in some cases, you may be having some yield challenges and they may have nothing to do with fertility. So it just helps you start to define what exactly is going on in the field. So I hope you spend some time in trying to get acquainted with some of the information that's contained in these reports, and I'll certainly help you as you get through and develop your nutrient plan.
Why is soil sampling important? I know that soil sampling can be a hassle, especially if you have a lot of land to cover and you have trees every few feet, which are going to be obstacles when you're trying to get across a lot. But the best way to get information about the management of your lot is to be taking soil samples and keeping good records. So observation is a great starting point to help you identify problems, but in order to properly diagnose them and be sure that what you're guessing is right, you'll need to understand what's going on under your trees. There's a whole host of reasons to soil sample, but basically in order to make the best management decisions, which we all want to do as good soil and good land managers, we need to have access to the best information. So that means taking your soil samples regularly, keeping records of them, and comparing them year to year to find differences within them. And then those are what's going to help you make good decisions. So now we're into the how-to. So soil sampling should be done in either the spring or the fall. For Christmas trees, you often hear you get better information from a fall sampling. But keeping in mind, if you've historically taken your soil samples in the middle of the summer, if you suddenly start taking fall samples, you're not going to be able to compare them over time. So what's most important is that you're sampling at the same time every year. And if you're starting out fresh, then yes, fall is a good time to start. What you'll need to do first is divide your lot up. So you can do this visually or based on the soil survey that we all know how to use now. So once you've divided your lot up, you'll need to randomly select subsamples. So I recommend walking a zigzag or a W pattern, I call it sometimes, because that covers blocks nicely, randomized, and evenly. But keep in mind you're aiming to be along the drip line of the trees because that's your management zone and that's what you want to capture in your soil sample. So you want to take several samples across the area and combine them to form the one sample that you're actually going to go ahead and submit. To take the soil sample, you should be using a soil core or an auger if you have particularly rocky land. And you want to make sure that you're getting the same depth in every subsample that you're taking. Make sure that you're labeling your submission boxes well. and that you know where you took that sample from. So preferably with the GPS coordinate or at least an associated map so that you'll be able to go back to it and know what site you subdivided. Submissions go to the Provincial Soil Lab. You can drop them off at any regional office and they'll ship them up for you. And you'll need a form to go with them. So there's a link at the bottom there for how to take a soil sample. That's a link from the Department of Agriculture, and there's also a form. So I'm going to show you those now. And send it with your sample. So you can put multiple samples. You see you've got a couple of rows there. You can put up to 10 samples in. You need to record your field size. Your crop previously grown is usually going to be balsam fir, and the crop to be grown is going to be balsam fir as well, usually. So you notice it says there, if you require a recommendation, please select a crop name from the list provided. Now, Christmas trees and balsam firs are not on the list provided because they do not have recommendations for Christmas trees yet. We're hoping to get that going soon. So part of the soil collection project that went on last year, the goal was to get recommendations to come out of the provincial lab. So that will happen eventually. For now, you see this section that says copy to. You can put my email in there, so jwoodworth@perennia.ca, and type your report, check in email, and they'll send me a copy. So as soon as I get the copy, I can look at it and call you. We can talk about your recommendations so that you know where to go from there. This is the other link that was on there. So this is a basic on how to take a field soil test. It's going to be a little bit different for Christmas trees, but this is a good PDF version that gives you an idea of why I say to do that randomized sampling. All right, so once the lab is done with your samples, they're going to send you a report. So this is a sample report. It has 2 sites on it, block 1 and block 2. And you'll notice that it doesn't have any recommendations on it. So like you'd see in other crops, that's because, as we mentioned, we're still in progress to try to get that rating column filled out as well. So from here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to let Amy go ahead and share her screen, and she's going to walk you through how to interpret the soil test report.
As Jay mentioned, on that soil submission form, they do have an area for crop to be grown, and you can put balsam fir. Unfortunately, though, again, Jay mentioned this too, if you do that, you don't get those recommendations. And in the red boxes, I've got highlighted where those recommendations, the required nutrient appears. And it's at the very end of the soil test report. It says required nutrient in kilograms per hectare. It's blank on this, it's because we indicated that crop is balsam fir. So for growers, I can imagine this is frustrating. It's certainly frustrating on our end too, I think, speaking for myself and Jay. But there's a few things that you can do to circumvent this. One is, I know Jay is going to talk later on about where she's pulled out some balsam fir recommendations. Or 2, if you want to, you could indicate another crop just to get some sense of what those numbers mean. I wouldn't use the nutrient recommendations on the bottom, but it'll give you at least the ratings, which are also appearing blank in that column. My pet peeve is just having floating numbers that have no context. So if you put in something like native pasture or any other crop, at least you get some sense of whether, for example, a 2,000 kilograms per hectare is really, really high or really, really low. So you can do that in the meantime too, if you just want to try to get a sense of what some of these numbers mean. They do report pH, and this is kind of confusing, and I'm not sure why they report the buffer pH. So this is the first line on the first 2 lines, I guess, on the soil test report. They have pH, which is basically the pH of the soil solution, and that's really what we're interested in here. When you hear someone talking about what their soil pH is, they refer to this pH. The second line, the lab has included a little extra information called the buffer pH, and they use this just simply to come up with the lime requirement. So it's the soil's ability to buffer changes in pH, and there's another value they use. Then they have a mathematical equation and they come up with the lime requirement. From a grower standpoint, I'd ignore the buffer pH. I wouldn't even look at it. I'd just go right to the soil solution pH, which is the one you want to look at, and then the next line, just don't even look at it. Where they use it is down again in the lime requirement, which I'll talk about a little later on, and that's also at the bottom of your soil test report. The next line down is organic matter percent. These two samples that were taken, I think I took these actually, and one was from a stand, a Christmas tree stand that looked like it was in a field, so more of a plantation type, I guess. And the other was a bit of a natural stand. And it was interesting, that 10.5% organic matter is really high. I typically don't see things that high, but it's likely that there was still some of that forest organic matter layer there, as well as a grass thatch that had been growing, and it really bumped those organic matter levels up. But organic matter certainly is important for lots of reasons. Christmas trees are so interesting because you're in a kind of a forest situation too, where the soil development is certainly very different than in an agricultural context. But if you have organic matters anywhere between 3 to 6%, you're probably doing okay. Organic matter levels can really depend on your soil texture and your soil type. When you get these reports back and you give Jay a call, or myself, certainly, we can certainly describe that a little bit further. So next on the test is they give you a measurement of some of these essential nutrient elements. There's 17 essential elements, and the test does not report them all, but it does report the phosphorus, which is P2O5, potassium, which they're measuring as K2O, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And all of these elements are measured in kilograms per hectare. Potassium and phosphorus certainly are considered macronutrients, and calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, they're also macronutrients, but sometimes they'll be referred to as secondary nutrients. And all that means is you just need a lot of them. So the plant requires quite a lot of those nutrient elements. You will notice though, there's one very important macronutrient that is not included on the soil test report, and that's nitrogen. And the reason really why nitrogen isn't included is because it's incredibly dynamic. Nitrogen, I always say, is the element that just likes to get lost in the soil. So if you measure it at any given day and you go back the next day, your measurements are likely going to be different. Nitrogen's not reported, and I know it's important in a Christmas tree context because it relates to color. So unfortunately, we don't have a real practical, I guess, in-field way to measure it right now. So next after your macronutrients, and I'll just skip back here, sorry, too. Sodium I skipped over. The lab is measuring sodium and reporting it. Again, sodium's not a nutrient element. It's not essential or considered essential for plant growth. They're reporting it here. Maybe it relates to salinity, maybe. Sodium on this test, again, is another line that I don't pay a lot of attention to be honest with you. If you think you have a salinity problem, you can get a separate test, a salt test. It's electrical conductivity. They're reporting sodium here, I think, quite honestly, just because they're measuring it, because the extractant they use here, malic 3, is the extractant they use. Is not great for pulling out sodium. So there's a few things here I don't pay a whole lot of attention to. The next group of elements I've got here in the red box are your micro elements, and these are your boron, copper, iron, manganese, and zinc. And so you'll notice something changes here too. They're measured in a different unit, parts per million. So we're not any longer talking about kilograms per hectare, they're measured in ppm. So it's a much smaller unit of measurement than kilograms per hectare. One thing I'll mention is boron. You'll see in block 2, it has a symbol and 0.50. What that means is that the machine couldn't detect the boron levels because it was less than 0.5 ppm. So it just means your boron levels are quite low. And I see that very, very commonly in soil test reports. Chances are, if you haven't added some kind of boron amendment, it'll be quite low. I'll also mention just above those micronutrients is aluminum is also reported. Again, malic 3 is not a great extractant for aluminum, but you know, you may want to just take a look at the number over time. As you see your pH increase, you'll likely see that value decrease a little bit. There can be some issues with aluminum toxicity in certain plants. I suspect balsam fir are quite well adapted to aluminum levels in the soil. If your pH gets quite low, below 4.3, aluminum toxicity can sometimes be an issue to plant roots. So as we move along, the next line of the soil test report is something called the CEC. And this is, stands for cation exchange capacity. You'll see on block 1 and block 2, the numbers are different. The big things that affect cation exchange capacity is organic matter and the amount of clay you have. And this really refers to the ability of the soil to hang on to cations, which are these positively charged elements. You can take a look at that, and the best way to use that little bit of information is to also make sure you're keeping in mind what your organic matter levels are and what your soil texture is, and you should start to see a pattern develop. Ideally, having a larger CEC is good. I kind of think of it like having a bigger bank account. You've got more you can hold in case you need it in times of need down the road. But sometimes that is really determined by your site conditions. So I don't worry about it too much. Unless you're seeing your organic matter levels are also really, really low, but they do all kind of work hand in hand. Then the lab also reports base saturation, and this is, I always find this kind of interesting. There's a little bit of history on why base saturation is reported on these tests, and it goes back to some work that a scientist named Albrecht had done. And it became very popular to think that there is this kind of ideal soil with these ideal ratios. And he had published these papers, I think like back in the 60s, and it really caught on. The thing is, since then, they did more work which showed some of those initial studies weren't necessarily 100% complete. And in fact, this idea of having these ideal ratios has kind of been debunked, to be honest with you. I'll look at this and I'll take a look at the ratios. Increasing work has shown that there's a lot more wiggle room, I guess, within these ratios. And if you're trying to balance your soils, I think sometimes you can get into, quite frankly, wasting some money. It's good to look at them just to make sure they're really not out of whack. The calcium to magnesium ratio you may want to take a peek at, and potassium to calcium, some of those larger cations. But overall, I don't worry about them too much unless you see something in your levels above which are extremely low or extremely high. And then finally, down here too, we've got the LRCACO3. It's called the second last line, I guess, on this report, tons per hectare to a pH of 6.5. So this is the lime required of calcium carbonate. That Ca stands for calcium and the CO3 stands for carbonate. And they're telling you this is how much lime you need to apply in tons per hectare to raise your soil pH to 6.5. And I know earlier Jay said the Christmas trees, you don't necessarily have to take them up to 6.5. I think it was a 5.5 to 6. So you want to take that with a little grain of salt. You could maybe reduce your lime requirements a little bit according to your soil test report. There are tables actually that will, based on this process or the method that they use, which is the Adams-Evans buffer method. The lab uses this method, and there are tables that correspond with this method that I can probably dig up if you're wondering how much lime to apply to get to 5.5 or 6. But the other thing to keep in mind is when they report this, they're assuming that that lime you're buying, that ag lime, is 100% pure. A lot of the times it's not. It might be 80, 85, 90, 95% pure, but chances are it's not 100% pure. So there's a number of little caveats in here that may affect just how much you want to apply. And I'll just take a minute here. We've kind of gone through each line of the soil test report. But just to put this into context, one of my colleagues who's now retired that I worked with for a long time, I think he gave the best analogy in terms of trying to do nutrient management with the soil test report and the nutrients in the soil. And he always said, Amy, you know, it's like measuring a teaspoon with a shovel. And sometimes we're doing a little bit of that. So don't get too hung up on the exact number, but I would really encourage everybody to take the soil test and to send one in. It is good information. It can give you kind of a global perspective of where you're at in your field and what's changing over time. That's especially important if you're sampling over time. But there are a number of things and kind of some ranges, I guess, of sources of errors within this. So just keep that in mind, and I wouldn't stress too much about getting those numbers exact, but it's definitely a good start. I always say in agriculture, this is the best deal you're going to get. As a registered producer, you get a discount on your soil testing fees. And I'll tell you, they don't even come close to paying for the equipment and the expertise in there that then the staff they need to run your samples. So if you're wondering whether or not it's a good deal, I can guarantee you it is. As I say, I argue it's the best deal you'll probably get in growing Christmas trees. So definitely encourage you to take a soil test report. If you get it back and you want to go over it, I know Jay's really familiar with these. If Jay's not around, I'm always happy to go through them with you too. So there's lots of help if they still see a bit foreign, and the more you look at them, the more familiar you'll get with the numbers and the more comfortable you'll get with reading them. So the last thing I've got here too is just the required nutrient. As I mentioned, that was not listed, and I think Jay is going to talk a little bit about how to navigate your soil test report without those recommendations.
All right, so this is kind of my quick review slide. So Amy did a really good job of breaking down her discussion kind of row by row is what you're going to see in that soil test. Because I know sometimes when that comes back, if you're not familiar with the soil test, it can be a little intimidating to try to figure out what that means. Because regardless of what the numbers say, what you really want to know is what you need to do to get to optimal conditions. So to review Amy's discussion, these are the big ones pictured here on the slide in terms of Christmas trees. So Nova Scotia soils are really acidic. And we say that across all agricultural crops, but of course, especially in Christmas trees, because you're mostly growing in woodlots. So you're especially more acidic than the acidic soils that we already have in cultivated fields. So pH level somewhere between 4 and 6 is what you're aiming for Christmas trees. And of course, this is based on a whole bunch of different extension resources that I pulled out of the States and out of Maine and New Brunswick. But kind of where I see most often, I would say, is that 5.5 to 6 is the goal. So even if you can get up to 5, I've seen soil test reports come out of you guys' Christmas tree lots and we're under 4. So there's still a long ways to go. To set that kind of intermittent goal of getting to 5 or 5.5, I think that would be a good start. Soil organic matter, you guys tend to have an advantage over other agricultural crops because you have ground cover, and that makes your soil organic matter. And what your organic matter does is help to hold soil, water, and nutrients. So I talked about needing to have moisture for your seedlings to grow. It comes from your organic matter. So you need to have a good ground cover that's able to hold on to things. So usually we say anything over 4% is good. In Christmas tree lots, you're going to see numbers well over that, usually around 7 to 10. Phosphorus is another one that you need for seed germination, and it also helps with root development. Potassium, that supports growth and disease resistance as well. Calcium is what's helping your tree deal with stress. And obviously you're going to have stress with the crop surviving over the winter. So calcium is a good one to help it deal with stress and become more resilient. Magnesium also supports that green color foliage. And I haven't mentioned nitrogen here because I think you're all pretty familiar with how that works. But nitrogen in Christmas trees, that's going to be your growth stimulator. And also it's going to give you that deep green color. So I think most of you would be familiar with how that works. The one other thing I wanted to mention in terms of Christmas trees, so when we put these recommendations together, so on this slide here that Amy showed you, there's no recommendations on it, but when I put those together, what I'm doing is basing them off of extension resources that I'm pulling, and I'll talk to you later on about where I'm getting that data from, but every time I get a soil test from you guys, so all the soil tests that were taken last year, that's been pooled together, and it's helping to form more robust kind of recommendations. So every time I do new recommendations, I update the recommendations and they get better and better. So hopefully we'll say a year or 2 years from now, we're going to have some really solid optimal conditions to have as the first starting goal. So your fertilizer recommendations are just going to get better and better. As far as what you should be looking for right now, the averages that came out of last year's sampling, the pH for Nova Scotia tree lots was 4.87. So still below that 5, but not as bad as some of the lower lots that we've seen around in terms of pH. Both of the blocks that Amy discussed were doing pretty well, especially that one that she described as a plantation site. So that was in a cultivated field, so we'd expect to see a higher pH there. The average organic matter from Nova Scotia lots was 7.61, which is pretty good. The average potassium was 188.1, and the average phosphorus was 115.38. Calcium was sitting right around 550, and magnesium around 115. So we're doing pretty good. Lunenburg County's results were a little bit higher than everybody else's. Cobequid region was leading in terms of pH, and in terms of organic matter, Northeastern pulled ahead. So there's some good components going on in all different regions, and of course these are just based on the soil test results that were taken last summer through that project. And we can talk more about that as the field season comes up again for this year. So I'm down kind of onto our last slide now. I wanted to kind of introduce or reiterate the concept of nutrient management. So what that is based on the idea that analyzing your record keeping, so your soil tests, your previous fertilizer applications, tissue tests, topography, whatever you have, you can go ahead and make more responsible management decisions that are going to supply the right amount of nutrient to the crop from the right source for that nutrient at the right time and at the right rate. So that's what we call the 4 R's of nutrient management. So that little circle up there at the top describes those 4 R's, and that's what we try to base nutrient management planning on. So nutrient management planners are trained to make these decisions for you and give recommendations on management that'll help you meet these considerations. So right now I do fertilizer recommendations for Christmas trees based on this data that I've pulled. Most of the information right now does come out of the States, so I have data in that kind of function, if you will, from Vermont, North Carolina, Maine. I also have New Brunswick in there, and then of course all the Nova Scotia soil tests. So what we're trying to do is get one individual optimal number that everybody should be striving for, but until we have that all put together, we're going to use the literature that we have available.
Seeing an increase in the pH levels of the province with a decrease in acid rain, and the reason I asked that question, we got some soil sampling about, I'm embarrassed to say how long ago it was, but we're back 35 years easy, and very acidic soils, and I'm in New Ross. I understand now from talking to some of the growers that so we were down to about 3.8, which didn't give us a lot of good out of our fertilizer. We were at about 30% usage rate or availability to the plant rate. Talking to some of the growers now, they're getting pH levels of 5. So is that is there a correlation there between the decrease in acid rain and the rise in pH?
I don't know how much it's affected pH. I know it's certainly affected sulfur levels in soil. So in some fields, we're actually seeing lower sulfur because of the acid rain. So that acid rain would deposit fair amounts of sulfur into the soil. We'll always have acidic soils here in this part of the world, mostly because of our precipitation levels. We get so much rain that it leaches out those base cations that tend to keep pH up, and that's why we get these acidic soils. So because we get so much rain, even if you apply lime, over time it will decrease. Now maybe acid rain perpetuated that a little bit, but I don't have any data on the tip of my fingers for that, but I am familiar with the sulfur, some sulfur work that was done with acid rain, so I would say that's definitely an issue. It likely has affected pH, but I don't know by how much.
Soil samples, I'm just kind of curious, I don't think I've ever got my head around this, but when you're doing soil samples, in this case for
for fur, right? What kind of depth should you be looking at?
If you can get to a depth of 15 centimeters, I would say to try to go to that. But keeping in mind, if you're taking soil samples in a Christmas tree lot, that won't always be possible. So I would say try to aim for 15. If you can't get to 15, then get to the depths that you can go to, but make sure it's the same in every subsample you're taking across the lot and make sure you're recording it.